The Pacific is now a Japanese lake, stained by the blood of Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nagumo commands the Kido Butai, 4 carriers, the mightiest strike force in history, sailing toward a small atoll called Midway. They believe they are invincible, completely unaware that their greatest victory has already sown the seeds of their final, catastrophic defeat. Just 6 months after the stunning, calculated destruction of the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the Pacific. Their banners flew over seas territories, from Wake Island to Singapore, and their power seemed utterly unchallenged. Their advance was relentless, an unstoppable wave of conquest that convinced every officer and sailor of their own divine destiny and military invincibility. This feeling of military supremacy, however, was not strength. It was hubris, a dangerous, blinding intoxication that led them to make a final, fatal overreach in their strategic thinking. The architect of this entire campaign, Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was the only one in the high command who maintained a true sense of caution. He had studied America, lived in America, and he knew that while the initial attack had crippled the fleet, it had only succeeded in awakening a sleeping giant whose boundless anger was now fused with its massive, untapped industrial might. He understood that the vast shipyards of America, now churning at war speed, would soon erase any numerical advantage Japan held, possibly as early as 1943. He calculated that Japan had only a brief, irreplaceable window, perhaps 12 to 15 months, to land one final, decisive blow that would force a negotiated peace before the scales of industrial power tipped permanently against the empire. The target he chose was Midway Atoll, the forward anchor of the American defenses, a base that represented the last viable staging point before Hawaii itself. By threatening and occupying it, Yamamoto planned to draw the surviving American carriers out of their lair at Pearl, forcing a massive, decisive battle, the historic Kantai Kessen, on his terms and timeline. To execute this massive operation, he committed virtually the entire combat strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy, spearheaded by the Kido Butai under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a striking force that represented the culmination of years of training and planning. Commanding this striking force were 4 heavy fleet carriers, including the flagship Akagi and the massive Kaga, accompanied by 2 smaller but powerful carriers, the Soryu and the Hiryu. These floating airfields contained over 250 of the finest naval aircraft in the world: Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo planes, piloted by veteran crews whose skill and experience were unmatched by any other nation. To the men of the Kido Butai, they were the undisputed masters of the air and sea, heading into a battle they saw as a formality, an inevitable final stroke. Nagumo's initial operational plan was methodical. The first wave would strike Midway at dawn to destroy its land-based air defenses, runways, and fuel dumps. The second wave, fully armed with ship-terminating ordnance, would be held in reserve, ready to launch the moment the American fleet was located. But the flaw in the plan lay deep in the crowded, metal-walled bellies of the 4 great carriers. Because the American fleet was considered a secondary objective to the crucial Midway bombardment, the maintenance crews had, by necessity and routine, prepared most of the second wave aircraft with land attack bombs, high explosive ordnance designed to smash runways. When the inevitable American ships were sighted, those heavy, cumbersome bombs would have to be manually hauled from the aircraft, stored on the hangar deck, and switched out for torpedoes and armor-piercing ship bombs. This procedure, the rearming, refueling and shuffling of 250 planes, was a frantic, chaotic dance on the low-ceilinged hangar decks, complicated by limited elevator space and the need for speed. It was a race against time and gravity. It created a logistical bottleneck of supreme vulnerability. Hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel sloshed through hoses, and bombs and torpedoes lay stacked openly on the hangar decks, waiting for the changeover. Nagumo's air crews, pressured by the urgent demands of battle and the tight schedule, were driven to rush this highly volatile process. This perfect storm of chaos, heat, fuel vapor, and exposed explosives was the fatal ingredient of the Midway disaster. This immense armada sailed confidently into a meticulously laid trap. They saw themselves as the ultimate hunters, yet they were the unsuspecting prey. Their colossal power was blind to the small, silent advantage held by the Americans, a fragile whisper of intelligence. The conqueror believed he was invincible, but the game had been called before the first shot was fired. In the sweltering silence of a Hawaiian basement, Commander Joe Rochefort and his cryptologists had done the impossible. They knew the target was AF, and they knew when the attack would come. They were a handful of men armed with nothing but patience, pencils, and paper, yet they held the fate of the entire Pacific War in their hands. The men of Station Hypo, operating in the cramped, humid basement of the administration building at Pearl Harbor, fought the war's most critical battle against codes. The air was heavy, stale, and smelled of constant coffee and cigarette smoke. Their relentless mission was to break the Imperial Japanese Navy's operational code, JN-25B. The greatest hurdle was confirming the target, AF. Commander Rochefort, an eccentric genius who often worked punishing shifts in slippers and an old smoking jacket, devised the legendary solution. He ordered the commander at Midway Atoll to send out an uncoded radio message stating that the island's fresh water condensing plant had broken down and the base was critically short of water. Within 24 hours, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message reporting, AF is short of water. The confirmation was absolute. The attack was coming to Midway, and Nimitz knew the exact timetable. But knowing the target wasn't enough. Nimitz was still outnumbered 4-3, and his entire counter-strategy hinged on using a ship the Navy had already written off for destruction. This was the invisible advantage the Japanese had never factored in. Armed with this intelligence magic, Admiral Chester Nimitz prepared his trap. His most immediate and pressing issue was the carrier fleet. The Yorktown had been severely damaged at the Coral Sea only weeks before, taking a bomb and 2 torpedo hits, and officially needed 90 days for proper repair. Nimitz knew he didn't have 90 days. He needed her now, if the trap was to work. In one of the most astonishing logistical feats of the war, shipyard workers ignored the clock and the official repair manuals, cutting corners that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. They worked around the clock, under floodlights, in 3 brutal shifts, welding steel plates over massive breaches, repairing the elevator systems, and patching crucial cables. They patched her up in a desperate 72 hours. They didn't just repair her, they performed a miracle of wartime urgency, creating a serviceable fighting warship where only a hulk had existed. She sailed out, a functioning ship with dozens of civilian repairmen still aboard, fixing her as she went, the barely holding together linchpin of the entire American strategy. Nimitz committed his entire available carrier force, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the salvaged Yorktown, 3 carriers against the Japanese 4. The plan was not to engage the massive Japanese battleship force, which was trailing the carriers, but to hide 300 miles northeast of Midway, exactly where the Japanese search patterns were designed to miss. They would let the Japanese strike the island. forcing Nagumo into his volatile rearming phase, and then strike with overwhelming power from an unexpected direction. As the Japanese fleet steamed confidently into the dawn of June 4th, 1942, the Americans held their breath, their position a fragile secret. The air on the American carrier decks was thick with anticipation and the smell of fuel. But beneath the fear was a quiet confidence. They knew what was coming. If you find this story of military strategy and historic turning points compelling, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us dive deep into the world's greatest historical battles and bring you more scripts just like this one. The American pilots climbed into their cockpits, the silence broken only by the engine startup, the vibration traveling up through the floor plates. They were flying into the teeth of the most formidable air fleet in the world, knowing the fate of the battle would soon rest on the frail wings of aircraft flying on borrowed time. The first American strike is not a victory, but a devastating loss. Across the vast, indifferent ocean, torpedo squadrons launched from the Hornet and Enterprise fly blindly, finding the Kido Butai only to be instantly consumed by a swarm of Japanese Zero fighters. It is a destruction of heroes, an act of self-sacrificial courage. The coordination of the American aircraft was utterly disastrous. The slow, heavily laden Douglas TD torpedo devastators flew independently, without their promised fighter escort, having become separated in the clouds. They lumbered toward the target at just over 100 miles per hour, making them incredibly easy targets. The sleek, lightning-fast Japanese Zero fighters, waiting high above the carriers, descended like synchronized assassins, their pilots, already veterans of 100 victories, eager to eliminate another dozen. The most infamous tragedy belonged to Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, from the Hornet. Led by Commander John Waldron, the squadron flew directly towards the Japanese fleet. As they dropped low to launch their torpedoes, a maneuver that required a straight, slow run, directly into enemy fire, the Zeros converged, turning the sky into a killing field. The planes were obsolete, slow, and lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. They were simply not designed to face this kind of resistance. The air above the Kido Butai became a screaming vortex of tracers and exploding metal. VT-8, which had started the day with 15 planes, was entirely eliminated, with only one man surviving, Ensign George Gay, who clung to a seat cushion in the water. VT-6 and VT-3 met similar devastating fates. In a matter of agonizing minutes, 35 of 41 American torpedo planes were shot out of the sky. From the Japanese perspective on the bridge of the Akagi, this was a triumphant rout. Admiral Nagumo felt a surge of relief. The American attempt to disrupt his rearming process had failed, and his defensive screen had proven its might. His pilots, exhausted but exhilarated, landed, refueled, and hurried to prepare for the final strike. It was a total, overwhelming defeat. 35 planes perished for nothing. Nagumo was celebrating his victory, completely unaware that the bodies floating in the sea had just saved the entire American fleet. But the sheer, brave courage of the torpedo squadrons had an unseen, critical consequence. They had set the stage for the catastrophic climax. The low-level, high-risk attack had forced every single Japanese Zero down to the water's surface to engage the slow-moving bombers. They chased the last sputtering planes until they were too low, too slow, and entirely focused on sea level. The entire air defense screen of the Kido Butai was now focused on the water, utterly blind to the heavens. Above, the Japanese carriers were completely, unknowingly, undefended from high altitude, their air cover drawn away by the decoy-devoted effort. This was the quiet, brutal success of the torpedo plane's ultimate risk. They had cleared the skies, creating the perfect 5-minute window for the American vengeance that was even then descending, unseen and unheard, from the silent sun. Admiral Nagumo has won. He is celebrating the destruction of the torpedo bombers and preparing his second strike. But deep in the clouds above, Major Clarence Wade McCluskey, critically low on fuel, makes a life-changing, unauthorized deviation in his search pattern. Just as the Japanese crews scramble to rearm their planes, the sound of an approaching siren, a high-pitched, terrifying shriek, splits the air. The American dive bombers, the Douglas SBD Dauntless, were running dangerously low on fuel, having searched fruitlessly for hours across a massive expanse of ocean. Major McCluskey, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, was nearing his point of no return. He was looking at the prospect of ditching his plane in the Pacific. Violating his orders, he banked southwest. It was there he spotted a lone, fast-moving Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, speeding to rejoin its fleet. McCluskey realized the destroyer was racing to rejoin its fleet after hunting an American submarine. He followed the ship's white wake, a clear line pointing directly toward the target. It was a stroke of divine, impossible luck, a needle found in an endless blue haystack. One ship's white wake, followed on a hunch, now pointed Major McCluskey's dive bombers directly to a target more explosive than any minefield. 4 carriers waiting below, completely naked to the sun. Just minutes later, 2 full squadrons of dauntless dive bombers, 33 planes from the Enterprise and 17 from the Yorktown, spotted the Japanese fleet. The sight was intoxicating. 4 immense carriers, steaming in perfect formation, their decks crowded with aircraft and the deadly chaos of exposed ordnance and fuel lines. The Japanese crews were caught mid-changeover, completely unaware of the plummeting threat. The decks were a lethal maze of fuel hoses, armed planes, and stacks of ready-to-use explosives, all waiting for a single spark. The dive bombers split into 2 groups and began their terrifying descent, cutting their engines and using dive brakes, the whistling shriek of the bombers announcing their arrival, a sound that drove panic into the frantic Japanese crews. First came the Enterprise bombers, led by McCluskey. They focused their attention on the 2 lead carriers, the Akagi and the Kaga. The pilots dropped vertically at nearly 300 miles per hour, pulling out at the last second, releasing a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb. The Zeros, still low, were scrambling wildly, unable to gain altitude quickly enough to engage the high-diving targets. The bombs hit. On the Kaga, multiple bombs tore through the deck, detonating among stacks of land bombs and fueling planes below. The resulting inferno was immediate and irreversible, a catastrophic chain reaction that sent chunks of steel deck skyward. Moments later, the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, was struck. 2 bombs detonated squarely in the hangar bay, turning the fueled and armed aircraft into a massive, immediate eruption of fire that consumed the bridge instantly. Simultaneously, the Yorktown bombers attacked the Soryu. 3 bombs hit her squarely, and she instantly dissolved into a catastrophic inferno, the chain reaction of fuel and exposed ordnance overwhelming the crew's ability to fight the fires. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 most powerful aircraft carriers in the world, the undisputed masters of the Pacific, were burning, helpless hulks. The Japanese Navy's offensive striking power was effectively destroyed. Nagumo was forced to abandon his flagship, staring back in shock as the Akagi listened and burned behind him. The great gamble of Midway had been called, and the price of the Japanese hubris was 300 feet of steel deck, now consumed by fire. This was the vengeance for Pearl Harbor, delivered in a terrifying, relentless flurry. We are nearing the end of this account, but please take a second to share this story with any history enthusiast who appreciates the drama of this incredible military turning point. 3 towering pillars of smoke rise into the Pacific sky, marking the funeral pyre of the Japanese Empire's invincibility. Yet, the fight is not over. The Hiryu, Japan's remaining carrier, launches a desperate, vengeful counterstrike against the Yorktown. This final exchange will determine the entire direction of the war. The last Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, survived because she was separated from the main formation. Recognizing the total loss of the Kido Butai, Yamaguchi launched a desperate 2-wave counterattack on the American Yorktown. The first wave crippled the American carrier, reducing her speed and cutting electrical power, forcing her to temporarily halt flight operations. The crew fought heroically to restore her, but a second wave of torpedo bombers ripped massive holes in her hull, tearing apart her patched-up structure and sealing her fate, forcing Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher to reluctantly give the order to abandon ship. The cost of the American victory was now visible. The Yorktown was lost. But the American response was swift and merciless. Scouting planes quickly located the isolated Hiryu, and a composite strike force from the Enterprise and the Hornet was launched for the final act. Finding the lonely carrier, the dive bombers descended, hitting her with 4 devastating bombs. The last carrier was instantly destroyed, erupting into a furious, uncontrollable blaze. Admiral Yamaguchi, recognizing the end of the Imperial Navy's dominance, issued his final order and refused to leave his ship, choosing instead to be lost with her. The psychological impact of this total defeat on the Japanese High Command was profound. Admiral Nagumo, once safely transferred to a cruiser, was utterly silent, staring blankly at the disaster unfolding around him, his career and reputation shattered. Admiral Yamamoto, who had confidently sailed east with his massive battleships, was stunned when he received the report. 4 carriers, the core of the Japanese fleet, were gone in a single day. The Japanese had lost nearly 300 aircraft, and more critically, the finest, most experienced naval aviators in their navy, a resource they could never replace. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. Yamamoto ordered a general retreat, sending his massive battleships home, without ever firing their main guns, in what he had hoped would be the definitive victory. The Japanese Navy would sail home, not in triumph, but in stunning, agonizing defeat. The Battle of Midway was over. The Yorktown, though abandoned, remained stubbornly afloat for 2 days, until a Japanese submarine found and finally eliminated her, sealing the tragedy of the battle's last casualty. Midway was the permanent shift. In 5 brutal minutes, the Japanese Navy lost 4 carriers and their best pilots. Their hubris was paid for by the genius of cryptologists, the luck of one desperate pilot, and the self-sacrificial courage of Torpedo 8. If you want more impossible victories like this, make sure you subscribe right now. Don't miss our next deep dive into history.